And bad morning to you. This is episode 44 of Bad Morning News on the 20th of September 2018, brought to you by Brave Browser, the ad resistant, tracker resistant browser, and our patrons. We have Cryptic back with us today. And quite a few wide ranging news stories from all over the map. And there was one that I actually wanted to try and cover yesterday, but ran out of time on, which I think we'll start with. Hang on, let's scroll back up to that. So this is from CNN Politics. So apologies to everybody for having to read this, but hey, it's worth at least seeing how the other side portrays events every now and again, with regards to what is actually going on in the world. And CNN is basically the deep state mouthpiece du jour. So it's worth seeing what they have to say about things just to know what kind of Intel Pro you're actually dealing with. So Trump inflames war on Justice Department by declassifying Russian docs by Laura Jarrett, Sophie Tatum, Katie Sullivan, and Jeremy Herb. This was updated 4 a.m. on GMT on September 19th. President Donald Trump showed no signs of backing off his highly unprecedented order to declassify various documents and text messages related to the Russian investigation Tuesday, saying he wants it done for, quote, transparency, which does actually sound legitimate. The move, which has prompted renewed unease about increasing politicization of intelligence materials, is likely to further inflame tensions between the president and intelligence and law enforcement officials who have been the target of presidential Twitter tirades and who have voiced concerns in the past about potentially jeopardizing sources and methods. We want transparency, and what I want total transparency, Trump said in the Oval Office Tuesday. This is a witch hunt, he added, using his derisive reference to the Russian investigation. It is a terrible witch hunt, and it's hurt our country, and the things that have been found over the last couple of weeks about text messages back and forth are a disgrace to our nation. And I want transparency, and so does everybody else. The president directed the Justice Department and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to initiate the immediate declassification of selected portions of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act application on former Trump foreign policy aide Carter Page, according to a statement Monday from the White House press secretary Sarah Sanders. Most significantly, his request also broadly included all FBI reports of interviews prepared in connection with the FISA applications, which are normally closely guarded by the FBI. When asked Tuesday whether or not he would declassify other documents relating to the Russian investigation, Trump only responded, "We're going to see." The president has floated the idea of declassification for several weeks, but Monday's statement from the White House was the first time the full breadth of his intentions was articulated, making clear that he expects the materials to be released despite the fact there is an active investigation by Special Counsel Mueller into any kind of links between his campaign associates and the Russian government. Earlier Tuesday, Trump quoted Representative Peter King, Republican from New York, on Twitter, saying what will be disclosed is that there was no basis for these FISA warrants, that the important information was kept from the court, that there is going to be a disproportionate influence of the fake dossier. Basically, you have counterterrorism tools used to spy on a presidential campaign, which is unprecedented in our history. Really bad things were happening, but now they're being exposed. Big stuff, Trump added in his own voice. There's a little bit more to this article, but I think that does summarize it fairly well. There are talks about an immediate briefing for the Gang of Eight and a number of other pieces in it, so it is worth reading further. But yes, the president is actively demanding this be dealt with. And more power to him, as far as I'm concerned at this point, because the entire system needs to be put on notice for what it's been up to. What do you think?
Definitely. I just think the framing that they put on it, as you mentioned in your comment, is just hilarious. I mean, I think they can find a reason to attack anything he does no matter what it is
Oh
at
yeah.
this point.
They don't even need a reason anymore. I mean, that's what that whole weather fiasco proved. I mean, who blames a president for the weather?
Yeah, I mean it's getting absurd. It's it's a bad day when I feel like I'm almost I mean, I've heard people say this, jokingly, that it's that all the SJW stuff makes them want to support Trump or makes them like Trump. And, in a way, it is amusing just to watch this whole thing, play out. And that's kind of been my position over the past couple of years, just sit back and just kind of watch the left crumble and pretend that this is some, unforeseen territory and the government was some pure actor before Trump came along, and now that he's sullied the great democracy they have in their mind, that now suddenly it's time to hate the government and oppose anything the president does. So.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, at this point, from my consideration, is the majority of the left, as we tend to call them, uh, uh, their definition of democracy is as long as I'm in charge, it's democratic. And if somebody else is in charge, then it's tyranny. And to be fair to the left, they've created the situation for tyranny to actually be possible because of all of the laws that were passed. That said, I still need to go through all the bloody EOs that Donald Trump has actually signed because a number of them actually eliminated some of the powers that were created for the presidency. So he actually potentially has thrown away some of the tyranny that they are so afraid of. Now he can recreate it. There's nothing stopping him technically. He can create another EO and basically do whatever the hell he wants with it. As long as it's for a very limited period of time, he'll be able to demonstrate it and then probably force something through Congress. But especially with the amount of strength that he has, and will probably have after the midterms, because I don't see a blue wave hitting. Oh, sorry, no, it's red wave, isn't it? Is what's actually going to be coming. Because
Yeah, the
red is
Democrats. Yeah, Democrats are blue.
Yeah, I keep. They should be red. I'm sorry. They should embrace the commie colors that they are. But hey, it can't be helped.
Yeah,
Yeah. So the blue team is not going to be winning this. They're going to have to probably suck up another massive defeat at this rate. And the ones that do survive are probably all going to be hardline socialists like Cortez because there is no real middle ground anymore in the Democratic Party. It's either a neocon or a hardline socialist. You don't really get much choice other than that at the moment. You don't have many centrists making plays for things because America has given up on centrism. They've recognized that bipartisan means equally screwed rather than equally culpable.
yeah, that's a good point. I feel like, I mean, there's been a lot of articles and talk about millennials embracing socialism, and in a way, I do see that where they're more likely to really jump on board and call themselves, democratic socialist or whatever, compared to generations previous to millennials. But I don't think they have any understanding of the true nature of socialism, and unfortunately, that's what leads to this just petulant demanding, like, give me free college, free healthcare, free whatever, and they just don't seem to have any grasp or concern that they don't understand economics at all, and that's the only choice now is either you're a young socialist or you're like a boomer conservative type or whatever.
Yeah, I
And
can't believe the number of times I've been called a boomer for believing that you should have to work for a living. But hey, actually, on the front of not realizing what socialism will actually do, why don't you hit up that free thought project on the DOJ rules for journalists and targeting them specifically?
yeah, All right, this is from the Free Thought Project, written by Derek Brose. Declassified documents expose DOJ rules for spying on journalists with secret codes. Newly released documents detail never before seen Department of Justice rules relating to conducting surveillance on journalists suspected of being an agent of a foreign government. On Monday, the Freedom of the Press Foundation released DOJ documents detailing the procedure for monitoring journalists using the secretive Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, or FISA. The documents were recently obtained via Freedom of Information Act lawsuit filed by Freedom of the Press Foundation and Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. The documents reveal that the DOJ is not required to satisfy a multi-part test designed to prove they have exhausted all options before targeting a journalist with surveillance, as is the case for obtaining traditional subpoenas, court orders, and warrants against journalists. Instead, Trevor Timm of the Freedom of Press Foundation notes the DOJ must only follow less strict court orders from the FISA court. FISA court orders are also inherently secret, and targets are almost never informed that they exist. Timm writes in a press release regarding the documents. The secret courts were originally created under the FISA Act of 1978 in response to reports produced by the Church Committee in 1975. The Senate committee was tasked with investigating the foreign and domestic surveillance operations by the CIA, NSA, and FBI during the 1970s. The Church Committee also released detailed reports on the government's COINTELPRO operations that were used against activists and influential voices of opposition during the 1950s and 60s. While civil liberties advocates have long suspected secret FISA court orders may be used and abused to conduct surveillance on journalists, the government, to our knowledge, has never acknowledged they have ever even contemplated doing so before the release of these documents today, Timm said. The Intercept also notes that the rules apply to media entities or journalists who are thought to be agents of a foreign government or, in some cases, are of interest under the broader standard that they possess foreign intelligence. Hannah Bloch-Webbe, a professor at Drexel University, told The Intercept that a probable example would be surveillance of reporters who are working for somewhere like RT, Russia Today, and as a consequence, anyone who is talking to reporters for RT. This would mean journalists like Ben Swann, Lee Camp, Jesse Ventura, Abby Martin, James Corbett, Rachel Blevins, the Free Thought Project, and yours truly, meaning the author of this article, might be under surveillance for association with RT. The Freedom of the Press Foundation is asking important questions regarding the release of these documents, namely, how many times have FISA court orders been used to target journalists, and how many are currently under a FISA investigation? The FPF also notes that the FBI should declassify their rules for targeting journalists using the controversial National Security Letters. National Security Letters, or NSLs, are a tool used by the U.S. government to force telecom companies to give customer information without the use of a warrant from a judge. They are supposed to be issued by the FBI to gather information from companies when that information is related to national security investigations. This information can include customer names, addresses, phone and internet records, and banking and credit statements. The most contentious part of the tool is the use of gag orders. When a credit reporting agency, telecom company, bank, or travel firm receives the letters requesting this information, they are legally gagged and cannot alert anyone to the government's invasion of customer privacy. So the article just goes on to talk more about FISA and those secret letters whereby they, it's as dystopic as it can get, where they can order companies to give up information on people and then restrict them from even telling those people that they're being, investigated by the government. So we'll keep our eyes on this and look out for other releases because that's the only way we ever hear about any of this.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of hoping that this is part of the reason why I'm kind of hoping things like that last article we covered on Trump actually do lead to some serious changes in the legal system. Because the whole FISA operation is, to be perfectly blunt, a shit show. I mean, it is literally, in a large number of cases, just a rubber stamp. They don't necessarily have to go over the material that's used to file the FISA, and they often don't. They just basically accept the prosecution or the DA's view of what needs to be done and act accordingly. That doesn't add to public security. That just is an assumption of guilt because the state said so. And that is a very strong way to force tyranny, which is again why I found it so amusing when the CNN group said this is going to increase tyranny by making such rulings more transparent. You are somehow increasing the politicization of the intelligence communities, which are violating the law effectively. I think personally, anything that is in gross violation of the law needs to be reviewed heavily and dealt with accordingly.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I'm very cynical a lot of the time, and I always think, oh, it's all a shit show. Even if they try to hold certain people accountable, ultimately it doesn't matter. But like you said, I mean, if it in cases where it is egregious, I mean, that's just, I can't argue with, starting somewhere as far as that goes.
Mm. Oh well. We'll see what pans out from the coming events, but at the moment, given how slow things have gone, I'm not holding my breath yet. I'm gonna, I think now I'm gonna jump to something a bit more local to me on my side. This is again, I'm basically trying to make September the Wayback Machine for bad morning news in a way because I've been looking at events that we've covered in the past and how they've progressed. And one of the events we covered not too long ago was the Scallop Wars. Well, I'm now dubbing these the Crustacean Wars because they've moved far beyond scallops. Uh, this is from the BBC, published about 4 hours ago. Cornwall crab pots, quote, deliberately damaged by French trawlers. Fresh fishing row has broken out after claims that British crab pots are being damaged deliberately by French trawlers. The alleged incidents occurred between the 6 and 12-mile limit off the Cornwall coast. The latest tensions come days after a deal was struck to end the scallop wars in the English Channel. The Cornish Fish Producers Association is discussing the issue with French fishermen in Plymouth. The lost or damaged gear is believed to have cost the Cornish fishing industry hundreds of thousands of pounds. The French fishermen, who are allowed in British waters, are notified of the position of British crab pots, but there are still multiple reports of damage. Local skipper Mike Taylor-Firth said he spotted a French trawler towing nets with, quote, not a care in the world. These are deep-sea trawlers capable of working in any weather conditions, yet they can be seen from shore almost continuously, or continually. We're out here in boats a third of the size and mostly single-handedly having to deal with this on a daily basis. Our Navy won't help, and neither will our government. Another fisherman, Jake Gilbert, said 160 of his pots were missing. Lack of respect. Cornish Fish Producers Association, CFPO, Chief Executive Paul Trebilcock said some fishermen were speculating that the damage could be Brexit related or from frustrations, quote, spilling over from the scallop wars. It's not acceptable for French boats to do deliberate damage within the UK's 12-mile limit. It's just a lack of respect for fishermen in general. The Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, and the French Embassy have been contacted for comment. The Royal Navy said it was a matter for DEFRA. In August, boats collided and fishermen threw stones at each other as the French accused UK boats of depleting scallop stocks. Two British boats, Golden Promise and Joanna Sea, returned to Brixham Harbour with damaged windows. It was given there were 40 French boats and only 5 British ones. That's a very, very polite way of phrasing it. But that's the end of the article in totality. So, yeah, I mean, what can I say? The ongoing conflict that could eventually become World War III in for the most part is it's just driving, I think, well, fishermen particularly insane. I don't understand what the French problem is here and why they are being so aggressive on this. I suspect it's something to do with Brexit and thinking that they can just get away with it because we no longer want to be part of the EU. But that's not how things work. That's not how the agreements have worked. That's not what the law states. And until they start basically moderating what they're doing here, this is not going to end well at this rate.
Yeah, definitely something to keep an eye on because this is all new to me. So very interesting stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, we did cover it a couple of weeks ago where the French were basically barricading, blockading, and attacking British ships trying to fish for scallops and other crustaceans legally as well. They are within their right to do so. The French claim that they are overfishing, but there's no actual evidence of that at the moment. And I think it's largely just effectively a territorial rights dispute over fishing rights that has yet to be fully resolved, and I'm beginning to wonder if it will, especially with the incompetence of the state as it stands. But hey, again, we'll see what happens with this. I think on a lighter note, we should probably hit Asia. This is some good news for pretty much everybody with a sense of reason and rationality, and maybe not so good news for the likes of the deep state and the cabal. North Korea's Kim wants fast denuclearization, South leader says. North Korea's leader wants to complete denuclearization quickly and hold a second summit with Donald Trump soon, South Korea's president says. President Moon Jae-in, who has ended a landmark trip to the north, said Kim Jong-un also wants U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to visit again. Mr. Pompeo said earlier he was ready to restart negotiations stalled since the first Trump-Kim summit in June. Mr. Pompeo said that the aim was denuclearizing North Korea by 2021. What did Mr. Moon say on his return? Mr. Moon Jae-in arrived back in Seoul on Thursday after a high-profile 3-day visit by the first by a Southern leader to the northern capital in a decade. Mr. Moon said Kim Jong-un expressed his wish that he wanted to complete denuclearization quickly and focus on economic development. He said he hoped Mike Pompeo would visit North Korea soon, and also a second summit with Trump would take place in the near future in order to move the denuclearization process along quickly. Mr. Kim has made pledges during earlier meetings with Mr. Moon and Mr. Trump about denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, but there were a few specifics and North Korea's progress faltered. Mr. Kim this week, however, agreed to shut one of the country's main missile testing and launch sites at Tongchang-ri. This, along with what Mr. Moon described as an agreement, quote, on its way to achieve denuclearization, appears to have swayed the U.S. Mr. Pompeo said it was on the basis of these important commitments that the US was prepared to engage immediately in negotiations. There is a little bit more around basically what the actual visit involved and what it achieved. But yeah, it looks like we are starting to see real signs that there is a desire for and a driver to achieve peace in the Korean Peninsula, a war zone for the past, oh Jesus, good Lord, it must be at least 60 years now. Yeah, almost 70. So, I mean, it's well past due that this ceasefire become a true peace accord and these nations finally reconcile what differences they have. Whether it means that there'll be a reunification of Korea, I have no idea. But at the bare minimum, it does mean a massive reduction in what will effectively be happening in that area for conflict. And it'll remove one of those big choice options that the deep states always had to go to cast mass amounts of fear in people. Your thoughts?
Yeah, this is definitely bad news for the military industrial complex and many other people. What you said about just the sheer amount of years this has been unresolved and going on made me think of something Ron Paul said once, where he, in reference to Korea, he said, why is the U.S. still in Korea? They've been there since I was in high school, and as you said, it's been probably 70-ish years, but it's this just made me think again about the previous article about Trump, where uh, mainstream, liberals and whoever just will find any reason to attack him. And when Trump was going out there and trying to reach out to Kim Jong Il, it was suspiciously quiet from a lot of liberals I know. I mean, nothing at all about this finally having this chance for some kind of harmony and resolution to this you know over half century debacle of and having US military bases in South Korea for unknown reasons to anyone alive now. um I'm personally tired of funding 19-year-old guys to go over there and indulge in all the red light goings on around all the U.S. military bases around there. It's just, another waste of taxpayer money. And I mean, I'm just glad to finally hear about this movement in the right direction, and hopefully it ends up, being a good thing and ends up finally resolving, because it's been forever, in my opinion.
It has, unfortunately. I mean, I grew up with MASH and did reports on the Korean War, and have always watched it just casually to see exactly what is going on with it, because it so frequently seems that it is used and as a bit of a saber to keep people scared and think that their military is a massive necessity. But hey, this is the world we live in at the moment, and thankfully, it does appear to be changing for the better for a change. Why don't you hit up that? Speaking of which, why don't you hit up the civil asset forfeiture article you picked up? Because it sounds like that's another form of change that's quite positive for us and bad for the state.
For sure. This is also from the Free Thought Project, written by Rachel Blevins. City forced to abolish civil asset forfeiture and pay back victims the millions it stole from them. The innocent family that had their home seized by police through civil asset forfeiture fought back, and their victory will affect other residents for years to come. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the city that has gained a reputation for the egregious civil asset forfeiture practices committed by its police department, will now be forced to dismantle the program altogether as a result of the lawsuit filed by a family who had their home seized by police after their son was accused of a minor drug crime. Residents who have been harmed by the Philadelphia Police Department's civil asset forfeiture practices could also receive part of $3 million in compensation. Markella and Chris Suravelis initially filed a lawsuit in 2014 after their son was caught trying to sell $40 in heroin on the street. The parents complied with the judge and took their son to a court-ordered rehab treatment, but when they returned home, they found that police had locked them out of their own house. The Suravelis family's home was seized by police, even though there was no evidence that the parents had any knowledge of their son's attempt to sell drugs, and there was no evidence that the parents or any other family members had engaged in any kind of drug-related activity deemed illegal by the state. The story received significant media attention as the country was introduced to the horror many Philadelphia residents face, and the district attorney eventually dropped the case against the family. In a statement from December 2014, Chris Suravelis said he was relieved by the verdict, but was committed to continuing the fight to ensure that other residents were not subjected to the same nightmare. After months of uncertainty, my family can finally rest easy knowing that our home is our home again, Suravelis said. I've lived in Philadelphia for over 30 years. I never thought it was possible for the police to just show up at my doorstep without notice and take my house when I've done nothing wrong. But that's exactly what happened to me and my family, and we're not alone. That's why we're going to keep fighting for everyone still trapped in Philadelphia's civil forfeiture nightmare. Suravelis worked with the Institute of Justice to file a new lawsuit, a class action lawsuit which alleged that the city was seizing 300 to 500 homes each year, violating residents' constitutional rights and illegally creating a profit incentive because the revenue generated by the program was going straight to local police and DAs. To say that the city has a problem is an understatement. While the city of Allegheny, Pennsylvania, filed 200 petitions for civil asset forfeiture from 2008 to 2011, Philadelphia filed 6,560 petitions in 2011 alone. A report from the Philadelphia Inquirer also found that the city brought in more than $64 million in seized property from 2004 to 2014, which is almost twice the amount raised by cities like Brooklyn, New York, and Los Angeles. A 2015 report from the ACLU noted that an estimated 32% of cash forfeitures are not supported by a conviction, which means that more than $1 million is forfeited every year from innocent residents in Philadelphia. The city of Philadelphia has now agreed to a settlement which includes the following promises according to a report from Reason. The city will no longer seek property forfeitures for simple drug possession. The city will stop seizing petty amounts of cash without accompanying arrests or evidence in a criminal case. The city will put judges in charge of forfeiture hearings and will streamline the hearing process. The city will ban the Philadelphia District Attorney and Philadelphia Police from using forfeiture revenue to fund their payroll. The city will disperse the $3 million settlement fund to qualifying members of the class action lawsuit based on the circumstances of their case. While the results of the lawsuit are encouraging, it remains to be seen how the Philadelphia Police Department will respond and if it will lash out at residents for the large decrease in revenue that was being stolen from innocent citizens. So that is certainly bad news for all of these, parasites out there who make their living just taking money wherever they see fit based on nothing. And I know you've studied this a lot, so just let us know your thoughts on this news, Lupinit.
Well, I mean, it's very good news that the city is having to abandon this program. It shows that people, or at least the system, is recognizing its own inconsistencies now, which is key to actually making changes. And there is some benefit to having a very strong judicial system based on the First Amendment and judges who actually give a damn about it. Not all do, but there are still some out there. And they're the good eggs that need to be promoted as high up as far as they can go in order for the system to, as it stands, to currently continue working. Unfortunately, at the moment, it seems that we don't have those options fully being recognized. We've had a lot of people putting into play rougher people, as one might say. But hey, it is good that the city is now actually being forced to pay and forced to reimburse those that they punished under this particular form of legitimate theft is about the only way to describe it, because that's what it is. It's a legal form of theft. They charge your money with a crime, and it has to prove its innocence rather than them having to prove its guilt of being complicitly used in that crime. As if an inanimate object can defend itself anyway. But hey, as I say, this is what we've been dealing with, and thankfully, people are starting to see how stupid it is. Let's just hope more people can. Speaking of stupid, I think it's time to bring up this one from The Guardian. Hillary Clinton in a blistering new attack on Trump. Our democracy is in crisis. In an afterword to her book, What Happened?, Clinton accuses Trump of undermining democracy and positioning himself as a tyrant. I may wind up, unfortunately, laughing in the middle of this article simply because it is amusing to see how the loser is portraying herself as a victim yet again. Hillary Clinton has unleashed a blazing attack on Donald Trump, accusing the man who beat her in the 2016 in the race for the White House of cruelty, negligence, corruption, dishonesty, racism, and malevolence that have combined to put democracy in America into crisis. Guess this is why the Washington Post says democracy dies in darkness. In an afterword to the new paperback edition of her book on her 2016 presidential election defeat, What Happened?, Clinton makes her most excoriating takedown yet of Trump's character and actions since he took office. The essay, published on Monday by The Atlantic, accuses the sitting president of undermining basic democratic values and positioning himself as a tyrant. Just to clarify, I do not agree with this article in any way. It was Obama who created the conditions for tyranny to exist, along with Bush and Clinton, and a number of other presidents down the line, going all the way back to Wilson. In unconstrained language, Clinton charges her former presidential rival with a raft of traits she suggests is an anathema to the healthy workings of democracy. He has shown, quote, unspeakable cruelty over family separation at the Mexican border, which was done under previous regimes for years. Monstrous neglect of Puerto Rico that led to almost 3,000 deaths, which was not his fault because the Puerto Rican government actually neglected its people and allowed goods to rot. And of breathtaking corruption involving his administration's conflicts of interest and ethics violations. Let's not even get started on that one. Trump and his cronies do so many despicable things that it can be hard to keep track, she writes, concluding that right now our democracy is in crisis. There are no tanks in the streets. The administration's malevolence may be constrained on some fronts, for now, by its incompetence. But our democratic institutions and traditions are under siege. No, the deep state's under siege, love, and there's nothing that you can do to stop it with all of this saber rattling against Trump. It's not going to fix anything. It's not going to change anything. You lost. Live with it. The impact of the latest criticism is amplified on this occasion, partly by its timing just weeks before the November midterm elections. That wasn't coincidental, when Trump faces a potentially bruising test of his popularity, and partly because it comes at a moment when other big guns in the Democratic movement are also letting rip. Barack Obama has also begun to make his presence felt on the campaign trail, endorsing candidates and sniping at Trump's politics of, quote, fear and resentment. Um, is anybody else noticing the projection here that's going on? I just have to highlight this. It seems so obvious to me, and yet it seems as if that's par for the course these days. Clinton's intervention is likely to fall on deaf ears among diehard Trump supporters who have dismissed her public comments as the bleeding of a loser. Well, I don't think it's just Trump supporters because I don't really support Trump here, but it is the bleeding of a loser, unfortunately. Trump won the election by 304 electoral college votes to Clinton's 227, although much to his chagrin, she won the popular vote, polling almost 3 million more votes than he did, all in urban areas, all in countries that were dead set for Democrats anyway. An indication of Clinton's low standing among right wingers is shown in Texas. Their Republican controlled Board of Education has recently voted to remove Clinton's name from the school's social studies curriculum as the first woman to win the presidential nomination of a major U.S. political party. Because it's not that big an achievement. If it was a presidency, I'd understand it. But I mean, there are other countries who've done far more to show that women can rule and lead just as well as any man can, which is, to be fair, when it comes to ruling, nobody's really capable. Clinton breaks down her critique of Trump into 5 categories, the most incendiary of which is her depiction of him as a racist who is guilty of venting hate speech. It's hard to ignore the racial subtext of virtually everything Trump says. Again, if you're reading into things that aren't there, perhaps that's an indication of your own mind, not of somebody else's. Referring to reports of Trump's derision of Haiti and African nations as, quote, shithole countries, she writes, hate speech isn't telling it like it is, it's just hate. Well, again, I don't really agree in the concept of hate speech even existing. There are valid things to hate, and hating having to live in a world where the best you can get is the worst you can get in almost everywhere else in the world. That's kind of what a shithole country means. And unfortunately, a lot of those places that were named do qualify. They aren't as positive as Western countries because Western countries are more developed. They could grow to be those types of countries if their best and brightest stayed there. But that's not likely to happen with the way things are going. Anyway, there is more to this article, but there's only a limit to how much I can read regarding Mrs. Clinton. And there's more important things that we could probably wind up covering, because to be quite frank, to me, this just looks like more blather from people who have failed to inspire a political movement to back towards the left and have done much to inspire backlash more than anything else. But what are your thoughts, Cryptic?
Oh yeah, where to start? Where to start? But yeah, her book title, I don't know if anyone recalls the seeing the design of that book, What Happened, where it says the title What Happened, and her name is right below it, and I think that's the most accurate description of all the things she's complaining about. What happened? It was you. It was fucking you. It wasn't Trump, it wasn't racism, it wasn't whatever. I mean, who knows? What's just bizarre about this, and what you said reminded me of this, is that she has driven this divide and into increased polarization to all the people who supported Bernie Sanders, and then saw what happened where the Democratic Party wanted to hand Clinton her anointed position as the nominee. And so, I mean, of course, all the young people, young idealist, types on the left all ran away, and none of them liked her. I mean, her platform of, hey, I have a vagina was just not that convincing to even a lot of, leftist types that I know from around Seattle, which is a super liberal place, obviously, but I remember during the election that people were like leftist types were so pissed that she got the nomination, and the only thing that made them decide to even lift a finger to try and support her was the scare tactic of, oh no, it's Trump, well, we have to vote for no. I mean, I know people personally who told me, yeah, I don't like Hillary, but just because Trump got the Republican nomination, I have to go out and canvass for Hillary. And
Ugh.
she told me that people would just, laugh in her face and say, just point out some of the many indiscretions and terrible things she's done. And it's pretty obvious that even people who would, be more sympathetic to liberal policies were just totally turned off by that, and she can't explain that away. So all she has to left now is to flail. So who knows?
Yeah. Well, as I said, there's a limit to how much I can discuss Miss Clinton before I start actually tasting bile. So I'm going to move on to another UK-centric article from the BBC. Again, about 4 hours ago, this was published. Head of prisons and probation asked to quit amid crisis. Head of Prisons and Probations has been asked to step down after 9 years amid an ongoing crisis in English and Welsh jails. BBC Home Affairs correspondent Danny Shaw said Michael Spur was prompted to resign because a, quote, fresh direction and new leadership structure was needed. Mr. Spur will leave his post in March 2019, the Ministry of Justice said. The news comes after the prisons minister, Rory Stewart, admitted problems with drugs and violence in numerous jails. Last week, thousands of prison officers walked out for 6 hours in a protest at, quote, unprecedented violence in British prisons. Mr. Stewart said that he would resign if the situation had not improved within a year. In a statement announcing the departure, Justice Secretary David Gauke said he was extremely grateful to Mr. Spur for his leadership of Her Majesty's Prison and Police Services. He added, it's HMPPS, so I'm trying to work out which one that is. I think Prisons and Probation, sorry. He added the formal process to appoint Mr. Spur's successor will start in October. In June, MPs described the systems for supervising criminals in England and Wales as a, quote, mess. The Commons Justice Committee said HMPPS reforms had failed to meet their aims, adding it was, quote, unconvinced reforms could ever deliver an effective probation service. 1 month later, it was announced that private companies that run probation services would have their government contracts ended in 2020, 2 years earlier than planned. Many prisons in England and Wales have seen surging levels of violence, drug use, and self-harm in recent years. Peter Clark, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, has demanded the government action at 4 jails in less than a year, including 3 state-run establishments. Last week, he triggered an, quote, urgent notification for Her Majesty's Prison Bedford after an inspection found inmates had effectively taken over the violent, overcrowded, vermin-infested prison. His annual report for 2017 and 18, the chief inspector highlighted how thousands of inmates are living in, quote, squalid and overcrowded cells, locked up for nearly 24 hours a day. Richard Heaton, permanent secretary at the Ministry of Justice, said on Thursday it was time to, quote, look ahead. Mr. Heaton said the next chief executive would need to develop, quote, a strategy for the next decade. Peter Dawson, director of the Prison Reform Trust, said Mr. Spur would be an extraordinary hard act to follow. Mr. Dawson added he is an exceptionally principled and knowledgeable leader who has selflessly served an endless succession of short-term ministers. And that's the end of the article. But yeah, I didn't even realize just how bad it had gotten. The crisis has been very low to come to public attention, over here at least. It's one of those sorts of things that may get reported once briefly and then never gets reported again, kind of thing. But now that somebody's actually resigned, it's going to actually have an impact. The problem is the system itself is fundamentally flawed. You can't. Part of many of the issues is the malum prohibitum laws that they have over here. It doesn't allow for anything to actually move forward. until those are removed, we won't see a significant improvement in prisons because people will be put in prison for reasons that are not logical or ethical. They're just purely arbitrary and derived from some sort of moralistic code that not everybody will necessarily share, or will require multiple moralistic codes that people won't necessarily want to have. But hey, it also shows that the prisons and police systems in this UK are aren't necessarily any better than the ones in the US. Not going to claim that they are necessarily worse, but they aren't better.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Just hearing how that works, but you know, like you said, I don't really have too much hope for the idea of reform. I mean, you hear so much about reforming police, and it's like, well, reforming is never going to do anything, especially if it's just simply in these very superficial contexts of like racism, like, oh, we need racial diversity among the police. Like, that will solve the fact that they criminalize shit that has no business being criminalized.
Precisely. And I think we can round off today with one last article from Africa. If you want to cover that one, I don't mind, mate. It's actually it's quite a good one regarding Uganda.
Okay, let's just pull that up. Okay, Africa. So this is from, let's see.
I think it's from the Mail and Guardian.
Okay. Okay, great. And this is written by Nick Cheeseman. Africa is urbanizing fast, and its leaders are struggling to adapt. In August, Ugandan musician turned independent politician Robert Kyagulanyi Sentamu, sorry about that, sorry for butchering the name there, better known as Bobby Wine. I should have just skipped to that.
You should just skip to that.
Oh, well. Too late. Went to campaign on behalf of Cassiano Wadri, another independent leader who was contesting a by-election in the Arua municipality. Wine's aim was to use his own popularity to help a like-minded colleague into power, and in the process deal a symbolic blow to the regime of President Yoweri Museveni. During the election, Wine's energy, charisma, and message resonated with those who have grown tired of Museveni's 31-year rule and are impatient for change. Fearful of Wine's growing support base and influence, which was confirmed when Wadri won the seat, the National Resistance Movement government detained and tortured him. Some commentators have described this crackdown as an unnecessary overreaction and asked why Museveni was willing to attract so much international criticism over a by-election for a parliament that his party dominates. The answer is that it was not the Arua municipality by-election that was keeping Museveni up at night. His concerns have much deeper roots, namely that urban areas overwhelmingly support the opposition, and this trend is likely to be exacerbated by Wine's emergence as a national player. The NRM's lack of popularity in towns and cities has not mattered that much up to now, because Uganda is a predominantly rural country, and so the president did not need urban votes to stay in power. But as the country urbanizes and as the government seeks to contain public dissatisfaction with Museveni's transformation into a president for life, the strong urban support for the opposition is becoming a greater threat. When old ways of maintaining power become less effective, the government will have to use other tactics to get the job done, which will probably result in an even greater reliance on brute force. Significantly, this is not just a Ugandan story. Instead, the case of Wine reflects broader trends across the continent. Africa is urbanizing fast, and as it does so, its politics is likely to change in five important ways. One, end to rural bias. In the 1960s, when colonized countries became independent, Africa was an overwhelmingly rural continent. In the 1990s, when multi-party politics was reintroduced, it was still heavily rural. But by 2040, most Africans will live in urban areas. The speed of this change is remarkable. According to data from academic and author of Party Politics and Economic Reform in Africa's Democracies and picture, Africa is the continent where urbanization has grown fastest since 1990, and 21 of the world's 30 fastest growing cities are on the continent. Number two, more difficult to rig elections. Although some governments use services to cultivate rural support, others use intimidation and coercion because rural voters typically have less access to information and are more dependent on government patronage and are more influenced by traditional leaders. They are easier for ruling parties to bully into submission. Number three, rise of populist leaders. There has been a lot of talk about populism in Africa, which is strange because, as political scientist Nicholas van de Waal recently remarked, in reality, there are few successful populist leaders on the continent. Michael Sata of Zambia was clearly a populist in terms of his rhetoric and campaigning style, and the economic freedom fighters Julius Malema is doing a good impression of one in South Africa today. That is pretty much it. Number four, greater decentralization. If governments fail to tame urban residents and populist leaders, emerge across the continent, we are likely to witness growing tensions between ruling parties and their critics. One side effect of this is likely to be stronger demands for urban self-government. While countries like Kenya and Nigeria have already devolved power away from the national level, on the whole, African political systems remain highly centralized. If a new generation of urban populist leaders choose to mobilize their supporters around the need for more powerful municipal governments with the capacity to pursue local solutions to local problems, this may start to change. And number five, end of urban-rural divide. One of the most interesting predictions about the way that urbanization will change African societies is the physical distance between rural and urban areas is likely to fall in the next 10 years. In addition to the emergence of urban corridors, the expansion of regional towns will see them increasingly encroach on the countryside. Along with the flow of remittances from urban workers to their rural kin, and the greater sharing of news and information that will occur as a result of the further expansion of WhatsApp, Twitter, and Facebook, this will further erode the urban-rural divide. So those are just a few interesting factors regarding the urbanization of Africa. And this is definitely something I need to learn more about and follow because that is very informative and it's something to watch and it'll have a big effect coming in the future.
Definitely. Definitely. I mean, I wanted to make a quick comment on the man who wrote this as well. He's actually a professor of democracy at the University of Birmingham and was formerly director of African Studies at Oxford University. So he definitely knows his stuff when it comes to this type of change in the African environment. And I do agree quite heavily that the divide between urban and rural areas will slowly shift. We're starting to see that in America and actually Britain to some extent as well, with the swings of the movements from progressivism towards populism and that kind of activity. When you have people sharing information and sharing points of view and opinions and their perceptions of what their reality is, they have to think, they have to come out with something that has meaning, as it were, to them. But it's how can I put this? It's another wait and see moment, because it could be that those dictatorial governments that have existed, as the article pointed out, for over 30 years in Africa in some cases, continue on. It's going to continue to be a problem. And I don't see the urbanization being the end solution, as it were. It's just another one, as it were, just another nail in the coffin of the state in Africa. As we're going to run a little bit over time, but did want to address a couple of the comments in chat. From Finian, I wonder what the law on the sea defense of your property wise. If you catch them stealing your traps, what can you do? I put out, we could never advocate scuttling aggressing ships with sea mines or anything like that, but it's definitely something that needs to be addressed pretty damn soon. Why is the U.S. in the other 600 bases all over the world shut the empire down? Couldn't agree more. From Danielle Hatfield, HRC and WAPO deserve each other. She's definitely noticing the projection that Clinton provided in her little essay against Trump. The left is totally neurotic, and from Gregory Patrick, true, but men grow better mustaches, so there is that. I'm assuming that was in reference to my comment with regards to May and Thatcher being examples of other nations having females as world leaders doing perfectly well trying to rule compared to men. I just think that no form of human being is actually capable of ruling without consent, and they try many different ways to manufacture it. But in any case, I think that's all we have time for today, people. This is Bad Morning News. Remember, smash the state and fuck the system. And have a bad morning, everybody.
Bad morning, everyone. See you tomorrow.